Hi, everyone. This is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. Welcome to our September federal policy update. We have a small group today, so if you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask as we go through. And thanks for your patience. I know I had to reschedule this one. So thanks. So what I would like to talk about today is first, we are expecting to get a new FHWA administrator very soon. The nomination hearing is tomorrow. I'll tell you a little bit about him. And then I want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the climate bill that just passed, and about the provisions in there that we were hoping to get, and then what we did, and then what we think went wrong with some of those tax incentives like the e-bike act. A little bit about then I'll go on to a little bit about the appropriations or budget process and what we're looking for in that. And then finally, what I'm watching as we go through the end of this year and into the next Congress. So I'm going to start with a new FHWA administrator nominee. So just first to give you a look at the DOT org chart, you've got Secretary Buttigieg up top with his staff, and then under the triangle is sort of their government relations people, the lawyers, those more operations folks. And then at the bottom are all the administrations that do the nitty-gritty of getting the work on the ground. So the Federal Highway Administration is in charge of all of the roads and bridges and biking and walking, or most of the biking and walking. So the administrator, or Shailen Bhatt, has been nominated for this position. Shailen, he was in the Obama DOT for a while. He has also worked at the Kentucky DOT. He's been the secretary of the Delaware DOT, and I think it's called executive director in Colorado, but he's run state DOTs before. So we've worked with him in the past. When he was in Delaware, Delaware rose up our bicycle friendly states ranking from being ranked 31st to being ranked 4th. It has since fallen, but during his work with a very bicycle friendly governor, they really made a lot of improvements, both in terms of the projects that got done, but the processes of doing it. He's also been a leader in some of the new technology coming out. And so we have worked with him at USDOT, at the state level. And then when thinking about new technology and new safety technology, he's also been thinking about bicycling and working with us on that. So I think he'll be really good in this role. And I look forward to working with him. His hearing is tomorrow, so we'll see how that goes. The other thing is, it's just really helpful to finally have someone, or assuming he gets confirmed and sort of out of that temporary role. It just, things just seem to work more smoothly. You know, they settle into the job. All of that will be great. I also just wanted to let you know that that Stephanie Pollock, who's now the acting, she has been great on our issues too. She's the one who put out the policy saying to state DOTs, when you're building new projects, you should be thinking about building complete streets, and you should be thinking about repairing and sort of fixing streets right before you're building new capacity. We were supportive of that at the League. However, it may have been that memo that got her to the point where she was not confirmable. We thought she would be confirmed. She was a very progressive Secretary of Transportation in Massachusetts. She put out some really progressive policies, and she's gotten some blowback from members of Congress and state DOTs. And I think the concern is she may not be confirmable now in the Senate. So we really appreciate the work she's done so far. She's been really great on things like making sure when we repair bridges, we put on biking and walking access and things like that. I think Shailen will also be really great at this. One sec, I got some more people joining. Okay, so he, as I said, Shailen will have his confirmation hearing tomorrow. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act, this was the big bill that passed at the beginning of September. I'm sorry, I'm just double checking everyone's in. Okay. That was about a number of things. For Senator Manchin, it was a lot about deficit reduction, but for a lot of us, it was really about that climate change piece of it. And so that's the part I want to talk about, because that's where the biking related proposals were and what we were trying to influence. So at the League of American Bicyclists, we really had three priorities for this. We wanted to see the bicycle commuter benefit included. We wanted to see an e-bike act to offer a rebate on the cost of e-bikes, to get more people riding e-bikes. Those two tax provisions did not make it in. However, we were also working on another sort of transportation infrastructure project that would fund complete streets, biking and walking safety, building biking and walking networks, and that's what this program does. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But before I do, in terms of what the decision makers were looking for when they were thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act and what was going to make it into the climate provisions, they modeled everything. So they were looking for emissions reduction versus cost. And so you can see that the provisions in this takes us down another 10% to a total of about 40% of emissions below where we were in 2005. Now, the US goal that we signed on to at the Paris Accords was 50%, to reduce 50% from 2005 by 2030. And so with this, we're getting a lot closer. So first, I'm going to talk about the Neighborhood Access and Equity Program, which is the one that got in the bill. So it's $3.1 billion, and it does three things. That it just improves. The main goal here is to improve access for people biking and walking. So that's looking at complete streets. It's looking at slowing speeds, which is something we haven't seen in this type of bill before, or this type of infrastructure before. It also, so it's sort of a combination of those biking and walking goals that we've had with what we've talked about as reconnecting communities, or the idea of going back and removing, remediating, or capping projects that divide communities. So that could be where someone has built a highway right across a community, which we saw a lot of between sort of the 50s and 80s, the 1950s to 1980s. And so just like the Reconnecting Communities project, it could be removal of that highway, it could be capping that highway, but this program goes even further in that it explicitly includes things like urban heat island, reducing flooding, reducing air and noise pollution, a lot of those externalities that come from a transportation project. So because we have a history of building particularly highways through low-income communities, and those communities have borne the brunt of those negative consequences. And so this is to go back and help that. But they also, so that's in there. They also think of improving vulnerable road user safety. And then finally, it also is money for the planning and capacity building, particularly in disadvantaged or underserved communities, so that they can use this money, so that they can apply for programs like this. And it can go back to sort of benchmarking, like, okay, what is the pollution now? Let's model how this new project will affect that. What sort of excessive heat or urban heat island effects are we having? How do we measure that? How are we going to measure transportation equity to make sure that we don't make more mistakes as we're trying to fix these? The funding is broken down into three categories. 1.8 billion is available for everyone or anywhere, all communities. There's a specific 1.1 billion that is set aside for underserved, low-income communities of color, those that traditionally have borne the brunt of these negative consequences from our transportation projects. And then, like I mentioned before, there's 42 million for technical assistance. And that is because one of the things that US DOT has learned and communities have learned is that they can create all these great grant programs, but low-income communities don't necessarily have the staff on board to take advantage of it. Applying for federal money can be really costly. And so this is a process to help with that. And this bridge at the bottom in Baltimore, or this Route 40, this is one of the types of projects that inspired this idea of reconnecting communities. It's a really underused highway below it, and the goal is to connect the people living on either side. Okay, so now let's talk about what went wrong in terms of getting the e-bike benefit. And a lot of these things also apply to the bicycle commuter benefit, but I'll talk about that a little more. So, and I broke it down into 4 things: the experience of the decision makers with e-bikes, what kind of experience have they had any, the partnerships, and then the cost projections for the tax benefits, and then sort of the data that they had in making these decisions. So first, on experience, I just want to tell you, as someone who does a lot of work on Capitol Hill, there's a lot of Congress members from around the country that are they're unfamiliar with e-bikes. If they've seen one, they don't know that they've seen one, right? Because, you know, if you're not familiar with bikes, if you're not really paying attention to them, you wouldn't necessarily tell the difference. And, you know, if you live in an urban community, you're going to be a lot more familiar with them. But, you know, most of Congress, most are not representing urban communities. And so there's just a lot of varied experience with biking for transportation. And there's still, it's interesting on the modeling thing, right? Because the infrastructure made it. So there's some acceptance or belief that if more people bike, that it's going to help with emissions. But that connection hasn't made it to the idea of electric bikes. So, I mean, I've been getting a lot of questions about what do we do now? How do we move forward? I'll talk about what the league's going to do in a few minutes. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about what you could do. And one idea is just get your member of Congress out on bikes, e-bikes or not. So, John, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I heard the other day from a state level person here in Maryland that Federal Highway had classified e-bikes as motorized transportation, and that there seemed to be some concern that that could interfere with, for example, the TAP program, which we use TAP to build multi-use trails. Here in the county, our multi-use trails are available for e-bike users. Is that correct? Is that that's work that, because that would be a big step backwards from, it's one thing to not get the e-bike bill through, but if they've classified them as motorized and it interferes with existing programs, that would be even worse.
Okay. So the new bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, so first I'll say there's different definitions of e-bikes in different laws. The new bill does have the 3-class system for e-bikes that People for Bikes has been pushing. And so, and it explicitly says that e-bikes can be ridden on non-motorized trails. That's specifically in the bill. That shouldn't affect trail building. Where the definition is causing us trouble is in safety data, because there's a manual that defines vehicles in terms of safety, and it defines e-bikes as motorbikes, which means that when we're looking at vulnerable road user fatalities, we can't include fatalities of people on e-bikes. But we're working on getting that changed. That was like a 2016 or 2017 definition. It only gets changed every 5 years. So we're hoping we can get in the new one.
Thank you.
Sure. So a lot of what I'm going to suggest, especially through this presentation is really sort of this awareness and trying to increase awareness on e-bikes. And this is a picture of Representative Quigley from Chicago. These are not e-bikes, but it is a critical mass ride, and he loved it. And so getting folks out on things like this can really help them, you know, if you can get them to try out an e-bike or even just see e-bikes, it's going to help change their mind about what they are and make them more sort of comfortable and familiar with it. Now, I think one of the other big problems we had, and I've talked about this a bit, is that the bike community was pushing for e-bikes, but the climate community and the environmental community was really focused on electric cars, and they have been for a decade, right? More than a decade. And so when Congress has a question about what should we do to affect climate change, they're going to go to climate experts, and they're going to and environmental experts, and those folks are really going to talk to them about electric cars. And so one of the things we need to do, it's up to us in the bike community to then start reaching out to the environmentalists and being like, hey, have you thought about e-bikes? Because when they started thinking about electric vehicles, e-bikes weren't really a thing, right? So that's something we can do. Again, if you're part of a local environmental organization, see if you can make a presentation, see if you can bring in some e-bikes, get them to try it. Think, you know, try to get them to think about, oh, wow, if I really did have a 2-mile transportation trip, I could easily do this, or even longer than that. So that's another place where we need to do a lot of work. And I will say we rarely see a change in law from just 1 year of advocacy or 2 years of advocacy. It often takes several tries. Unfortunately, our first try was when we had this big opportunity. So we're going to have to look for other ones. But one of the things we need to do is really work on those partnerships with environmental groups. Another is just our basic experience, the bicycle community experience, that most of our time and resources have been building on relationships with the transportation staffers and the transportation sector. So, you know, for me, I probably spend 90% of my time on the transportation committee. And the way that this works, the e-bike benefit would be in the tax side. So again, even another thing we need to do then is increase exposure of e-bikes and bicyclists in the bicycling community with those who work on tax law. And so that's a finance committee and the Ways and Means Committee. So this is basically the same idea of what you can do, just a little more directed, is if you have a member who's on the finance committee and a senator on the finance committee or a representative on the Ways and Means Committee, go have a district visit meeting with them next time they're home. Or, you know, see if your local bicycle organization is interested in getting them out on a bike ride, or their staff. We spend a lot of time focused on the member of Congress, but the staff is also really helpful. And I will share the slides later so you can have all these links. Got my numbers funny, but the other thing is cost. So when Congress is debating whether, right, we talked about how they were modeling benefits versus costs. And so there's this joint committee on taxation, and that's their job to figure out what the cost is. And when they did this, the numbers are really funny. So the e-bike benefit that was in the final draft of the Build Back Better law that passed the Senate, passed the House, did not get through the Senate. So for the e-bike benefit, your income had to be less than $75,000 a year. The top benefit you could get is $900, so $900 per bike. And the benefit was only going to be in place 5 years, right? And they estimated that at a cost of $4.5 billion. Now you look at the electric car benefit, and this is in the Infrastructure Reduction Act. The income level is much higher. It's up to $300,000. The top benefit is much higher. It's over $12,000 per car. It was going to be in place 10 years, and they estimated that at $9 billion. Now, you know, in talking to congressional offices about this, you know, they would say to me things like, well, look, right now, bike trips make up 1% of transportation trips. And you're asking for 4.5% for 1%. I mean, even if we got bike trips to 5%, you know, it was just hard to make that argument when 9 billion was going for a mode that makes up 75 to 80% of trips. Now, there's a lot of funny things going on in this, or there's just a lot of weird specifics within the electric car benefit that keep it low. A certain percentage of the battery has to be made in the US right now. There's no electric cars sold in the US that meet it. The top benefit is 12.5, but it's based on a lot of different things. And so most of those benefits, they aren't going to come in immediately, and most cars are not going to get that full piece. So that's what's keeping the electric car number artificially low. The e-bikes number, though, is just crazy high. And in talking to folks in the bike industry, they said we couldn't even produce that many e-bikes to sell as they have based this on. And again, it's just sort of lack of exposure. I want to give some props to People for Bikes. As the industry group, they went in there, they brought in industry leaders who tried to talk with the Joint Committee about why their numbers were off. They didn't have a ton of success on that. They may have had some success, but that is something at the Hillside that we really need to work on. And on that idea of what you can do, one thing that we're seeing is more and more states are putting in e-bike benefits. And I think when we get those real numbers, those numbers will help us truth it out with the folks on Capitol Hill that Colorado has an e-bike benefit. California does. I think Massachusetts just passed it. I know Connecticut is working on one. So while we're waiting to build our argument at the federal level, do consider looking at what's going on in your state, and if there's a way to talk to your local state group and see if there's a way to do this there, because I know People for Bikes is supporting those efforts. I mean, we're supportive too, but they're involved, actively supporting with funding and resources. So what we're doing moving forward, the idea between education and visibility, we are working with People for Bikes on this. As USDOT is rolling out the programs either from the infrastructure law or from this bill about charging stations, we're trying to, you know, in some cases they have to be specifically for cars, but we're trying to make some that could be like, there's a formula program that states have to do, and those are just for electric cars, but there may be some discretionary grants that people can apply for. We're trying to push DOT to make e-bike charging eligible for that. We're talking about making the e-car charging near bike share. People need to go out and do something while their car is charging, things like that. We're also working with Representative Blumenauer's office, advocating for the U.S. Postal Service as they're investing in new vehicles to invest in e-bikes. There's already 50 places around the country where the Postal Service works with biking or has biking routes. So we'd love to see more of those become e-bike routes. In terms of the partnership, like I said, we are working with environmental and climate orgs. Part of what we're doing now is working on the greenhouse gas emissions rule, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So we're trying to help them and hope that they'll help us in the future. Another thing, sort of the experience with the, you know, spending more of our time sort of working in the tax issue. We are still looking at, you know, we're doing this outreach with congressional offices. We have another bill coming up we might try to work on. And then of course we have the bicycle commuter benefit. So, which may have there may be some opportunities for the commuter benefit that wouldn't work for the e-bike benefit that we're going to try to start really building those relationships. When it comes to adjusting those cost estimates, that's really something we're letting People for Bikes as the industry group lead on that, because they're the ones who have that data. All right. And then just quickly, I want to talk about the bicycle commuter benefits separately, because this one, I'm a little bit more confounded on why it didn't get in, because the cost estimate is so different. It was 200 million over 10 years. 200 million is a lot of money, but when you were talking about the size of the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not that much, particularly over 10 years. And so while there is that, it makes me wonder, one, about the modeling, but also two, if there wasn't another reason why this didn't make it in. But because it is small, there may be other avenues for passage. So you may hear from the league in the next few months, sort of working towards this. Every year at the beginning of the year, they do a bill to extend tax credits, particularly environmentally related tax credits. So we may try through there. Also, Congress is more familiar with it. There's not a lot of people against it. There's just not a huge oomph of energy for it. So that's something you'll be hearing about as we continue to regroup and do education on e-bikes. Okay, so I want to switch for a second and talk about the budget process that's going on right now. So I talk a lot about budget and appropriations interchangeably. When we talk about budget, we're talking about the whole federal budget, right? If you think of that as a pie, appropriations is each slice of the pie. So there's different slices. There's a slice for, say, the military, and there's a slice for health and human services. The slice we care about is transportation, housing, and urban development. So it's often thought about as transportation in HUD or THUD or THUD. Oops, wrong way. So what we're talking about now is the next fiscal year, which actually starts October 1st. So transportation is a lot different from the other slices. Because we have this highway trust fund where that money is designated just for transportation, then we get a 5-year transportation bill, and that bill not only lays out policy, but it also lays out funding. For almost every other program, they have to go through the funding process, this appropriation process, every single year. So for folks who work on CDC funding, it's every single year. Or education funding, it's every single year. So when we think about appropriations, and the reason we don't talk about it quite as much is because most of the things are covered. The things that aren't, Amtrak isn't covered, transit isn't covered, and there's some other non-highway trust fund programs. The things we are really focused on this year and last year, there were 2 programs that made it into the infrastructure bill that were created or authorized, but they weren't funded. So their appropriations were not through the Highway Trust Fund. And if you came to the summit, you heard about these and you probably lobbied on them. One is the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. And the idea behind this is that a community could apply for a big chunk of money. So instead of just building one project, they could get a bunch of money to fill in their network. And so we were really supportive of that. We wanted to see that. So for communities that have pieces of bike lanes all over the place, or maybe they wanted to look at their sidewalk network, they could just in one chunk sort of get in there and make huge differences. The other was a program called Healthy Streets. And the idea behind that was to look in low-income communities and communities of color that are suffering from an urban heat island effect. So they're getting excessive heat, or they're getting flooding around bus stops and around walkways, sidewalks, areas. It's sort of like a dignity in transportation. How can we improve the case where it's flooding out, or where, because it's all pavement, it's getting to 120 degrees on summer days. And so this program was a very targeted climate mitigation program that would say, okay, we're gonna use reflective paints where we're getting that urban heat island effect, or we're going to use porous surfaces where it's flooding, or we're going to plant trees to help with both of those issues. So those were the two programs we were looking at. Since the summit, Congress has come back, the House and the Senate have come back with their proposals. We didn't get our full ask, but in the House, we did get funding for both programs. So the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program was funded at $100 million a year, Healthy Streets at $55 million. In the Senate, we didn't do as well, although we did secure $25 million a year for that Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. So that's where we are right now. The House bill has gone through the entire process on the House side. So it's passed the committee, it's passed the House floor. The Senate bill, they just released the budget. They haven't gone through those pieces. And so we would expect the next step to be for the Senate to go through those pieces. We may not see that. I want to talk a little bit about why we saw the differences between the House and the Senate bill. And one of it has to do with partisanship. So in the House, the Democrats have a slightly bigger majority, which means they control every committee. In the Senate, because it's 50-50, a lot of the Senate committees have equal numbers of members. And so that makes it a lot harder to pass something like this out of the committee. It also means that the reason we got the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program was because it had bipartisan support in the Senate. Healthy Streets did not have that bipartisan support, and I think that made a big difference. What we expect to see now is when the bill passed the House, it was almost exactly along party lines. I'd have to go back, but it was very close to that. And that's because Republicans think that these bills are too large. They think all the appropriations bills are too large, including transportation. And so they're looking for things to cut. Because the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program was not bipartisan in the House, because Healthy Streets was not bipartisan in either, that puts them on the cutting block. We need to protect them. ATIIP, it's because it made it into both bills, it's a little more solid. Then the other thing that was interesting, another reason why we maybe didn't see those, is that the Senate bill actually includes additional funding for things like Safe Streets for All, which we like. Safe Streets for All got $6 billion over 5 years in the bill. So it's interesting to me that they chose to add another $100 million to it in this budget versus some other programs. One of the other things is that now that we are seeing earmark projects in there, that takes away from the money that's available for these other programs. Earmarks are one of those things. Biking and walking often does really well in those. So it's sort of a, it's an interesting question. But as I was saying, the Senate bill normally should have to go through the committee process. It's not likely. What we're more likely to see is that behind the scenes, they'll take the Senate proposal and the House bill that's made it through and try to work out those differences. And then they'll just take it right to the floor and pass. When they take it to the floor and pass, it will probably be combined with a bunch of other bills. So there won't be a lot of changes at that point. Here's where things get tricky. The fiscal year ends September 30th, and we're not going to have a budget. So what we are going to see is basically an extension of last year's funding. Every time they have to have one of these votes, there's always all this press about we're going to have a government shutdown. Honestly, that's unlikely. I think they'll come to an agreement by September 30th to extend this bill, and they'll extend it through the election. But just know you might see that. The other thing I'll just mention on that is that transportation funding won't be affected by that, again, because of that whole highway trust fund piece, or the majority of it won't be affected. But here's, again, if the Republicans take over a majority of the House and or the Senate, they're going to do another continuing resolution until the next Congress takes over. And then they're really going to cut those funding levels, which again means we'll really be on the defensive for those programs. The other thing I just want to mention, because the House bill did go to the floor, we did see amendments. There were over 600 amendments introduced. There was 190 amendments that were heard on the floor, although a bunch of them were just bunched together. Some of the things that we did see introduced, amendments to cut all that funding to that active transportation infrastructure investment program. We also saw amendments to cut transit funding and a lot of different amendments going after electric car charging stations funding. We also saw what I'm calling anti-equity amendments, but amendments that would have defunded the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, amendment that would have defunded their Thriving Communities program, which is a technical assistance program specifically to low-income communities and communities of color and communities experiencing persistent poverty. And there was also one to defund the Department of Transportation Equity Action Plan that was introduced by Representative Groffman from Wisconsin on the screen. That amendment, that final amendment, actually got a vote. And it was defeated. There were all the Democrats voted against it, and there were 7 Republicans who voted against it. But again, his amendment was combined with a bunch of others, so we're not 100% sure. I bring this up because, again, appropriations has to happen every year. And the reason so many amendments weren't heard, or why was because the Democrats didn't like them. The Democrats were in charge on the Rules Committee, which decides amendments. Next year, if we see a flip, we may see some of these amendments getting to the House, getting individual votes, and potentially passing. We've been in that position before where we saw regular votes on funding for biking and walking. So just something we need to watch for and consider. I mentioned briefly about the greenhouse gas emissions performance measure. The USDOT earlier this summer, they put out a rule. So when USDOT wants to enact a new regulation, they first have to put out a draft rule and allow for public comment. And then they take that comment back and they make a final rule. So we're in between those stages. They put out the draft rule. Now is our chance to comment. What this rule says is that states and MPOs would have to estimate greenhouse gas emissions coming from their transportation sector. And the rule gives them a formula how to do that. They don't have to figure out how to do that. So they figure that out, and then they have to set targets. What is controversial about this is the idea that the targets have to reduce emissions. So the rule that USDOT wants to put out is saying, okay, states, figure out what your emissions are now, then tell me how you're going to reduce them and how you're going to get your state in line with these US goals. So if you remember, we had that chart on the Inflation Reduction Act that showed that we're trying to reduce our emissions from 2005 by 50%. That's the goal they're talking about. And then the state would have to update it every 2 years. And the MPOs, those are metropolitan planning organizations. So all the big cities, those metropolitan areas would have to do it every 4 years. There's a lot of opposition to this. This says potential opposition. I had started these slides from before. We've heard from some state DOTs. We've all against it, but we've also heard there's a group of, I think, 10 states that were in favor of this rule. And so they've put that out. But we're also hearing from the road gang. We're also hearing from some conservative interests that USDOT is overstepping its power in doing this. It's overstepping its authority. And they're also making an argument that it harms states. So and by making that argument, they're asserting standing. so that they can take this rule to court. And so the argument is based on, the DOT's argument is based on the fact that in 2012, the transportation bill at that time created performance measures. One was created around congestion mitigation and air quality. And at that time, the Obama administration took the position that, okay, that means we can regulate performance of greenhouse gas emissions. And it was literally like a week before Trump took office, they put out the rule. And then when the Trump administration got in power, they rescinded the rule before anyone had to do anything. But they never questioned whether or not it was legal to do that. So now the Biden administration came in and said, we're going to reinstate it. What the Biden administration did, which is different, is this idea that you have to reduce it. And the law doesn't specify that. The transportation law doesn't specify that. And so that's where the legal concern is. It's really, and if the states don't do it, the penalty is that they have to write a report on why they did it, because both sides agree US DOT hasn't been given the authority from Congress to have a monetary repercussion for that. So that's where the fight is. And given the Supreme Court's recent decision on limiting the EPA's authority to mandate carbon emissions, there's some concern that this is going to go into legal trouble. But the folks who want the bill, both want the rule, US DOT, the climate community, they're saying that it's important that US DOT has the ability to regulate the impact on roads, that they have that legal authority. And so we need to put that into comments. And they're asking organizations to help out with that. So the league has put in comments. Our comments were related to, we took a template that NRDC and the environmental community had worked on. We made it a lot more bikey, and then we put in our comments. If you're interested in writing comments as an individual, you can go to our website and take action and do it there. If you represent an organization and you want to put in comments and you haven't yet, just email me and I can send you our template letter. You can just put your logo on it, make any changes you want to, and send it into the Federal Register. We've still got a month on this, but we really want to help them beef up the number of comments. All right. I'm going to talk through some of the implementation of the bill. I realize, I've been talking about it as a bipartisan infrastructure law. So that's how the administration talks about it, because they like to lead with the word bipartisan. So bipartisan infrastructure law, when I'm talking to US DOT, I use those terms. Congress calls it the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, because that's what they named it, and they are taking ownership of it. So depending who you're talking to, that's how you want to do this. And this part, I'm sort of aiming at Congress, so I'm going to use IIJA. One of the things that can be really helpful or really interesting is sort of to track implementation of that funding. That's one of the things we're trying to do. It's one of the things I get questions on a lot. How do we know what's been funded? Because the problem with infrastructure, right, is that the DOT may have awarded a grant, or your state DOT may have awarded a grant, but it's going to be a while, right, before the construction starts and before completion. And so, knowing what it is, it can help you to focus your advocacy on what you want to work on next. You may want to go back to the plans that are out there and say, hey, what about these things that are supposed to come next in the plan? Look at what you want to apply for next, all those sorts of things. It's also a great opportunity for you to just get back in touch with your members of Congress, but also your state and local folks, and say, hey, we're so excited about this project. It just got awarded this money. Thank you for voting yes on the IIJA. Or, thank you, local government, for putting in this application. So I'm going to talk about a couple of ways that you can sort of track some of those projects. Right now, it may be a little bit too early to see those awards, but I thought I would get this out now as we move forward. So specifically, when we're talking about transportation alternatives projects, this is a link to the Safe Routes School. They used to be the Safe Routes to School Partnership. Now they're the Safe Routes Partnership, where they are tracking in every state when a transportation alternatives competition opens, when it closes, if the state has a separate competition for Safe Routes to School, who's the person in charge, the TAP manager. Every state DOT has a TAP manager, the website, the Safe Routes to School website if they have it, and a Safe Routes to School manager. And so this is something, they're going to update this. You can look through to see, hey, when is the next competition in my state, if it's up there, or when did it close and when will we know what the results are? And the results are generally on that website. The other thing we did see, which are the RAISE grants, those came out last month. And biking and walking did really well on these. And again, RAISE grants, they used to be build grants. They were Tiger grants before that. They do multimodal projects or projects that in some way were just hard to fund before. Maybe they cross over state lines or something like that. But they're super popular. This year, because of the infrastructure, the IIJA, every state got a RAISE grant and DC. Some got multiple. I often go to the Urban Institute analysis. It's Yona Freemark who's there. That's his Twitter handle. He does some great graphs if you're ever looking for graphs on that. By his analysis, 68% of the projects were transit, bike, ped, or complete streets. There are 24 projects that were just a major bike ped project. In general, those are trails or separated infrastructure of some sort. And there were 50 complete streets projects. So that's really good. You know, we definitely do better under RAISE grants than we do just in general transportation funding. Also, one of the shifts that we've seen with this new administration is that significantly less are going to new road capacity or building new roads altogether. And that roughly half of their funding are going to communities experiencing persistent poverty. So they're really trying to keep their promises on equity, on safety, on climate. So there's a link here to the RAISE projects. You can look those up. One of the things I think can be really helpful, you know, I know folks come into the summit and we meet with your members of Congress or their staff once a year, but in the middle of the year, if you have a chance to reach out and say, hey, this great thing is happening, you should come look at this great thing in our community, or, you know, preferably a positive thing, you know, but if you can just keep in touch with them regularly, that can be really helpful. If you can keep in touch with them and add a thank you at the same time, that's even better. So when you're seeing great projects come into your neighborhood or good projects come into your community, you know, if you know about them, I showed you 2 ways to find the TAP and the RAISE grants. You can also check in with your local government or MPO and sort of ask how things are going, if there's any if there's a new project list that's being funded. Always helpful. And then once you know about the project, if there's a way to highlight it, maybe you can find an article that's already been written or a press release. Maybe you can write a blog for your local organization or even your community newsletter or listserv or something like that. And then let the staff know, you know, get in touch with them. They're going to know about the RAISE grants because those are such a big deal. The congressional offices are involved, but they're not going to know about a transportation alternatives grant or a safety grant or anything like that. So letting them know about that can be really helpful. This is just a picture of the Hawaii DOT website. And they actually do I had to scroll down a little bit, but went to their transportation alternatives page on that list from Safe Routes Partnership. Scroll down, was able to find the projects that have been awarded. And then you can also see they have an application ranking, which is really neat. And then in Hawaii, they also talk about what they want to do next. So that's super helpful. And then you can just send them an email. If they voted for the IIJA, you can say, you know, thanks for passing that job. This is a great project that our community is getting because of that. And oh, and here's an article about it, or if you put it, and here's what the, League of American Bicyclists had to say about it, something about that. They voted against it. You still want to say, hey, look, there's this great project coming to our neighborhood. It's going to improve safety. We can't wait to see it on the ground. Here's something about it. You don't have to mention the bill, but just shows them that our community is paying attention and we're connecting it back to them. So that's just sort of an ask as projects come out, something you can do that's really helpful to continue building that relationship with your members of Congress. I'm going to talk quickly about what I'm watching coming forward. In Congress, we have a couple of bills. There's a Parking Cash Out Act that's already been introduced. It's Earl Blumenauer, and this goes a step beyond the bicycle commuter benefit. It's the idea that if an employer is offering free parking and they're using it as a fringe benefit, if they're taking credit for that, then they also need to offer a cash out for employees that don't drive. It goes beyond the bicycle commuter benefit. It's more of a reach bill, but it's great that it's out there. We're also working on a bill that would set an official reimbursement rate. So if you use your bike for work trips and your employer reimburses people for cars, they can now reimburse you for your bike trip. I'm also watching and expecting to see, looking into next Congress, I expect to see Congress go after an automated vehicles regulation bill again. There's a new automated vehicle caucus in the House, so we're waiting to see what they do, but something that's on my radar. At the USDOT, we're expecting more direct guidance on highway safety, vulnerable road user safety. And that's where the directions that USDOT gives to state DOTs. That could be critical for safety. So I'll be reporting out on that. Safe Streets for All, that application period ends this week. Reconnecting Community ends in October. So we'll be looking for announcements, looking at that. And then also that GHG performance measure, we're hoping to see a final rule this soon. It closes in October, probably maybe in November. I just also want to talk over at NHTSA and car regulations. We expect to see a draft rule come out on hoods and bumpers. So when we're talking about the size, weight, and shape of trucks and SUVs and larger cars, that would be the place to talk about them. The other thing is we already put in comments on a new car assessment program, trying to get automatic emergency braking testing done with bicyclists. So when NHTSA puts out their 5-star rating, it's in there. So that's what I'm looking for. We've had a little bit of a lull over the last month, but I think things are starting to get busy again. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Let me see. Any other?
Maybe this is Lon Hultgren in Connecticut. Maybe this is not quite on top of things, but are most all of the grants and the funds coming through the MPOs these days?
So what comes from the MPO, transportation alternatives comes from the MPOs, and then there's a surface transportation program that comes from that. And those two together make up our transportation alternatives, makes up 50% of bike ped funding. That surface transportation grant program makes up another 15 to 20. So the majority of bike ped funding is going to come through that. But the safety funding generally comes through the state. And then these grant program and the bridge funding comes through the state. There's a new rule on the bridge funding that if it's a repair, they have to include bike ped access unless it's over 20% of the project.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. My email and phone number are on the bottom. I will send out the slides and a link to the webinar probably tomorrow. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Caron.
Thank you.